Welcome everyone to the new semester and to what counts, among other things, as an odd example of the fellow seminar at the Cogut Center. And it's a real pleasure to have this panel today and to have all of you here to talk about Hannah Arendt in various contexts. The most immediate context is the existence, and last night the screening of an extraordinary film called Hannah Arendt, directed by Margareta von Trotta, and we're delighted to have the screenwriter, Pam Katz, with us as a kind of guest of honor today to talk about the film and its connection to Hannah Arendt further. There are other contexts as well. We've just completed the year that counts as the 50th anniversary year of the publication of Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a book that was, as you know, extraordinarily controversial when it appeared 50 years ago and has really maintained itself as one of the most discussed and most controversial books of journalism and political philosophy of the 20th century. As you know, if you've seen the film through the course of its evolution decided to focus on the trial and on Arendt's reporting about the trial as the kind of central episode into a biographical treatment of the person and her thinking itself. This semester, Bonnie Honig and Ariella Azoulay, who are members of our panel here, are also teaching a course on Hannah Arendt, and I expect them to say something in relation to that. So let me introduce the panelists further and say a couple of words, and then we'll move on. So Bonnie Honig, professor in MCM, political science, joined us this year. Ariella Azoulay in Comp Lit and MCM has celebrated her first year on the faculty, right? It came January last year. So this is, among other things, a kind of fantastic new blood occasion. Pam Katz, the screenwriter for the Hannah Arendt film, has worked on, I believe, 6 films up until now with Margareta von Trotta, is that right?
It was our third,
Third,
actually, yeah.
Oh, hype.
But more to come.
And among other things, teaches screenwriting at NYU. Ted Bogosian, well-known documentary director, member of the Directors Guild of America, and involved in a project known as the Global Media Project at Brown. Started at the Watson Institute a couple of years ago, and now a collaborative project between MCM and the Cogut Center. And Adi Ophir, professor of humanities, with us this year at the Cogut Center. What I'd like to do is invite Ted to begin the discussion talking with Pam about the film, since they're the two film professionals on the panel. Ariella is too, but I hope that doesn't, not terribly an accurate thing to say. And have the discussion really fan out from the film into broader issues. And then we'll have enough time to open things up for questions and discussion from the floor. So Ted, I'll pass things over to you, and we'll go on from there.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you all for coming. How many attended the screening last night? And how many have seen the DVD or otherwise seen the film? That's wonderful. That really informs the discussion. So I'm a documentary director, but I'm also a dramatic director, and can appreciate this monumental achievement of yours. Congratulations on that. It's lasting, and one thing that I want to say immediately, we just met, but most writers that I know like to stay in their rooms and work on their computer or write on their yellow pads. And you're obviously so personable. So what kind of a writer are you, and how did you collaborate with Margareta on this film?
Okay, I'll try. Now, we discussed that a bit last night, so since many of you were there, I'll try to rephrase it in some interesting ways. But we work together in so many varieties of ways. That's the first thing. But we met on Rosenstrasse, and we met in a context where she'd worked on a film for years and years. Nobody would give her any money to make it, and she said, "I want a modern-day perspective of an American Jewish person." And I immediately panicked because I was afraid I wouldn't be Jewish enough and that I wouldn't know enough or have the perspective she was looking for. But almost from the first moment we met, we had so much in common, despite our incredible differences of background and history, because she's a very curious person, and so am I, and we both like to read for a very, very long time before we make up our minds about anything. So in the case of Hannah Arendt, the first thing we did after kind of, as she will say this as well, that she was very hesitant of making a film about a thinker, and I was jumping up and down unrealistically saying how great and perfect it would be. And as I said last night, I said she made a lot of people angry, and therefore we had to find some drama there. But we read probably easily for a year before even beginning to talk about how to make the film. And what to focus on. And as I said last night, we focused at first on her whole life. And it took probably 3 years before we came to the idea of just focusing mainly on these 4 years. But what we do is we read, we talk, we write. In this case, I often was the one giving the first suggestions in script form, sending them to her. Whether or not the scenes would take place in German or English, she would translate into German so she could understand it, make her remarks, send it back. I would have to translate everything into English so I could fully feel and understand it. And then every so often we would punctuate each year in the 8 years that it took this film to get made. We would meet and sit in a room, and as I said, she would embarrass me by making me read the whole thing out loud. As a writer, you never hear at least in my case, you never hear what's wrong as well as when you read it out loud in front of another person. And it's something that I often do, just pretending that my worst critic is there. I read it out loud. And we meet and talk, and then I go back with my pages of notes, and we send it back and forth by email. And this just goes on for a very long time. And we met. The other thing that's very important that Margarita says, you can read as long as you want, but until you meet the people who either knew her or were influenced by her work, you can't figure out a way to bring it to life. So we also met her biographer, Elizabeth Young Bruhl, who unfortunately died quite young recently, and Jerome Cohen, Lotte Kuhler, who's in the film. We met anybody who had heard of somebody or knew somebody that knew Hannah Arendt, we met them. And that we generally did together.
So did you discuss the bilingual nature of the script, and how did you arrive at this sort of German-English combination?
There's kind of two parts to that. The first, more banal part is that we simply decided it would be best to have people speak the language they would actually speak. So she would always speak German to her husband, even when they were in New York. She would speak German to Blumenfeld. She would speak English to Mary McCarthy. But the second and deeper reason for that is that a huge part of the film is there to communicate the condition of exile, the life of an emigre, and despite how social she was and how wonderful these parties were, she was a lonely woman for those reasons. She always suffered having been kicked out of her country and having lost to a certain extent her language. And in order to communicate that, we thought it was important to show that mixture of languages, how she would have to roll into English, how when tempers flared at the party, they rolled into German. And we thought that was the way to really show what emigre life was like in New York, and particularly for her.
So when did the concept of putting her on trial, as it were, develop? Because that's one thing I think is very interesting about the story structure of this film, the way ultimately it goes from Eichmann being on trial to her being on trial.
Well, when did we decide to narrow it down to this, or when did that theme kind of
When did the theme emerge?
I mean, in a way, I feel like the theme of her work on Eichmann was there nearly from the beginning. Even if we attempted initially to do her whole life, it was always, again, I feel like I'm repeating myself for those of you who were there last night, it was through the lens of Eichmann. And the importance of that for me was being by her side in a moment of exile, in the moment where she suffered what she had essentially suffered her entire life. So that having been kicked out of Germany, imprisoned in France, and then fearing the loss of the emotional and intellectual affection of America was very painful for her. So staying by her side allowed us not just to experience those turbulent years, but also something that she suffered and experienced and reflected upon her entire life. I thought it was a big key to her as a person.
So 2 more questions before I invite everyone else in. One is, were you involved in the casting? And can you talk about that process of finding Barbara?
I mean, the first answer is, Margareta is in charge of casting, but we both knew that this script was impossible without Barbara Sukova. That it could not have been written as it was written for any other actress. Other actresses' names came up from producers, from various television people, and Margareta always said, without Barbara, I won't do it. And I always felt as I was writing, and the best example, of course, is the speech, the 8-minute long speech. Nobody could do that, in my opinion, but her. So she was a kind of a fixed figure up, but somebody for whom we had to fight a bit, shockingly. I mean, she's won now every prize the world has to offer. I mean, the film's not eligible for the Oscars for various reasons. She was still on A.O. Scott's top 5 actresses list. She won the Academy Award in Germany. She won the huge acting prize in Munich and Italy, everywhere. So it's amazing now to me that we ever had to have a conversation about it. So in terms of her, that was fixed. We chatted about casting. I knew what was going on, but it was Margareta's choices, and wonderfully so, I think.
And so much of Barbara's performance is internal, without dialogue. And I wonder, in the script, how was it that you notated that in terms of the action, what you needed Barbara to think about or to ruminate on, to perform as she did?
First, I should say that there's an incredible relationship between Margareta and Barbara. They've done actually 6 films together, and so a good deal of those scenes that are the silent scenes, that are in so many ways the most important scenes, I unfortunately can't even take credit for. It's really about their communication. I think what the script did, and this is again, Margareta and I wrote it together, and Margareta's very responsible for keeping me true to the emotional line of the script. I tend to get too intellectual, and I was focused very much on the film's intellectual goals, with the understanding that if we didn't get close to her, there's no movie. But in terms of finding the silent moments and making sure that there were opportunities in the script, that was really on the page, Margareta disciplining me, and then the two of them get together and they just take that and run with it. But part of Barbara's technique, though, is to really, and we've talked about this, there are brilliant actresses who impersonate people that they play. And Barbara doesn't do that. There's some of the mannerisms, but she toned the accent down. She looked like her up to a point, but she inhabits the role. And part of that was reading a tremendous amount about her as a person and her relationships, also the letters, but also reading I can say that by the end she probably had read more of her work than we had. Even so, she inhabits the person and tries to be as they were, and that's her.
So were there lots of rehearsals, or did you have cold reads, or just go for it?
If there's any film students, these films are made on a shoestring. There is a lot of discussion. I was, for the speech, once it was done and had been done and raked over for years, I went over to Barbara with a shopping bag full of books. She had her philosophy tutor on the phone, and we went through every single line when she objected to something. There's a lot of discussion. There was basically no rehearsals. In fact, the speech was the second day of shooting of the film. They wanted it to be the first day, and Margareta and Barbara protested and said, please give me one day on the set before I have to give this 8-minute long speech. So no, it's done, this actress and what Margareta achieves on a very short shooting schedule and very short shooting days and very little help in the way of infrastructure is incredible.
Well, I'd like to know what you all think about what Hannah might have thought of this movie. Anyone? It's a big question, but I went back and I went through the New Yorker pieces she wrote, and I didn't read them all, but I scanned them all. And I just wonder what she might have thought about this distillation of her work, this presentation.
The only answer that I can think of is her text, when the speech that she gave when she received the Honig Prize, And she explained in so many pages. Bonnie and me, we just talked about it yesterday in our class on Arendt. We opened the seminar with this amazing text when she explains in length why she doesn't deserve the prize. And if there is one reason why she deserves the prize, it is because it is a European prize. And what is her contribution to the European culture is that she didn't give up on speaking her mother tongue, which is German. So this is the only reason for her why she deserves a prize. So I think that she would appreciate the movie because it articulates her speaking, insisting, being clung to German, but she would say that she doesn't deserve this movie.
Now, do people come up to you after screenings and challenge you like they challenged her?
At screenings, there's been, the amazing thing is that the things that we've been challenged about at screenings, which has happened far less often than I expected, it's the same things they challenged her about then. It's still this conversation about the Jewish leaders and her blaming the Jewish people, despite I felt that we took great pains to kind of clarify what was said and what wasn't said there. There are some scholars who felt this or that, but I must say the main Arendt scholars that we work with, those who are still alive, love the film. And that was great because you're always walking a tightrope between wanting to make a film that people who don't know who Hannah Arendt is can understand and enjoy and learn from, and not make a film that the scholars will laugh at because they find it too shallow or simplistic. So there was a tightrope there that I felt has gone pretty well. But when there are people, and this is very gratifying, who like the film but still don't like her. They think she was wrong. They agree with Hans Jonas's point of view, which was very much my intention that his side was respectably presented. Some people don't think, and this is more critics feel that we erred on the side of Hannah Arendt and made her detractors look less intelligent than her. That wasn't our intention. I don't think Kurt Blumenfeld or Hans Jonas seemed less intelligent than her. That's been a criticism. But by and large, we haven't been challenged too much. There's been a few occasions, as I'm sure you know, where the film in journals has been used as an occasion to re-attack Hannah Arendt. Rarely, but it has happened. It happened after the film closed, interestingly. While it was on, most people we met knew very little about her. So they weren't coming in with an agenda, which was nice.
Bonnie, you were nodding about that.
She thought psychoanalysis was reductive insofar as it was, as indeed it wanted to be, a science. She missed the way that psychoanalysis diagnoses the knot of desire that is singular also, though. And yet she had a psychoanalyst appreciation for the detail that marked the often self-thwarting paths taken by humans in their quest for happiness, peace, or safety. Her best biographer was a psychoanalyst, and I note that the film we saw yesterday begins and ends with Hannah Arendt on the couch, the mise-en-scène of psychoanalysis, then the last place she would want to be. This interpolates the audience into the position of analyst and her into the position of analysand. If we're the analyst, then our mirror in the film is the woman with whom Arendt's husband is having an affair, Charlotte. She is a psychoanalyst, and indeed she psychoanalyzes Arendt behind her back to her husband. If we can almost miss this point of identification, it's surely because Charlotte is so unlikable a character that we're reluctant to identify with her. In fact, I did miss this identification the first time I saw the movie, but last night it struck me. And what Charlotte says in the psychoanalytic scene is both trite and important, I think. She says about Arendt and her exposure in the wake of the Eichmann and Jerusalem controversies, quote, "She thinks her sarcasm will protect her. It only shows her vulnerability. She should show her pain. It is out of character for her, but if she represses it, it will overwhelm her." Unquote. So I told you it's trite. There's more than that at stake, I think. Her repression, Arendt's repression, because I agree there is repression there, in fact clouds her thinking, and her avoidance of psychoanalysis may lead her to get Eichmann wrong, and also to be blind to what I take to be, now that I've thought about this film, her own repetition compulsion, a pattern of behavior that I'll describe here, in which she repeatedly puts herself on the brink, in danger of exile or of becoming an outcast, and then has to save herself from that fate. The film shows just one episode of this, but she did it repeatedly throughout her life. She seems in the film and in life to be unaware that she does this. She seems to think that this all just comes with the terrain of thinking, and maybe it does, Or maybe this is why she thinks as she does. So let me explain. What do we see in the film with Arendt on the couch? We see her fragility, her worry that she may lose her home in the US, having already lost 2 others in Germany and in France. And we see her disappointment in Eichmann as a fundamental problem for her. She says twice in the film, quote, "You cannot deny the gap between the unspeakable horror of the deed and the mediocrity of the man," unquote. Now, we know many survivors go through this, and it isn't just about Eichmann. When victims meet their torturers on the streets after war or conflict in Argentina, in Sudan, in South Africa, or in Germany, they report they are shocked by the smallness of the torturer. Without his henchmen, instruments, darkness, isolation, and all the rest that makes for the scene of torture, without the vestments of cruelty, the man can never live up to the monstrosity of the deeds. Out in the open, the former victim is less small and the victimizer is less big. I think Arendt's disappointment with Eichmann is like this. He wasn't her torturer, but still she knew what he had done and she expected something grander. This isn't to say she was right, that he was just a normal, cliche-ridden bureaucrat, nor is it to say that she was fooled by what she saw, as many have argued. That is, what they say is that he was really a monster, but put on an act for the trial, and then she fell for the act. But it is rather to say, in a way that she would have hated, that psychoanalytically she was going through survivor trauma. Someone who had been capable of great evil disappointed her because she needed the agency that had destroyed her world to be bigger. And she responded this way to the re-traumatization. While others demonized Eichmann and made him larger than life, which was their response, so he would be as big as the evil that he committed, she sought to explain his smallness as the source of the offense. She did this, I want to suggest here, and I'm still thinking about this, so I'll put a question mark at the end of all of it. She did this, I want to suggest, in order to assuage her disappointment in his smallness, rather than to have to explore her disappointment in his smallness. She became invested in the very thing that was re-traumatizing her, his normality, his unworthiness of his crime. And so she didn't get past her disappointment enough to explore the other possibilities. And as a result, I do think her portrait in Eichmann in Jerusalem is a bit flat or two-dimensional. She never asked whether it would be possible that he could have appeared one way in the dock, in the glass box of the trial, and another way in the camp during the war. In the war, he had power. In the dock, in the glass box, he's powerlessness and tries to find power in what he has access to, the documents, the bureaucracy, the arguments about what he did and didn't do. Why does he bother with this defense of his, someone asks in the film. Arendt in the film shows that she knows the answer. When she talks in an opening scene with Mary McCarthy about her divorce, which her ex is fighting with her over, and McCarthy wonders why is he fighting, Arendt tells her, people always want some possibility of power. But she doesn't accord the same possibility, the same subtlety to Eichmann. There's also another detail that I think belies the idea that Eichmann lacked depth. And this is actually from the book Eichmann in Jerusalem. It's a curious little detail in the book. I've never known what to make of it, but she reports and doesn't comment on the fact that he apparently told Jews during the war, and maybe also some Germans, that he used to live in Palestine and that he was fluent in Hebrew and Yiddish, which is like a totally weird fantasy, right? Which suggests, it calling for some psychoanalytic interpretation. Okay, so back to Arendt in the film and in life. I just have a couple of last points to make. Here is her cliche. It's not that she repressed her feelings and so was traumatized again by the impact of her unfeeling actions on others. It is that she entered into a repetition pattern that she projected onto others repeatedly with a psychoanalyst's eye and a literary critic's touch. She often said about others that they had patterns, that they were habitual, that they couldn't break out of a certain received script, that they failed to break their patterns because somehow they failed to think, all the while implying that this was not her problem. I want to suggest that this was precisely her problem. Why shouldn't it be? It's a human problem. For Arendt, thinking provided her with a way to recreate over and over again, each time with more success, the conditions of unwelcome, violence, and homelessness from which she had suffered in ways large and small since her escape from Germany. The psychoanalytic detail that the film offers up for those who know something about her larger life is the possibility that she recreates the condition of precarity for herself so that she can be the one to survive again. This time, each time in an improved way, without having to leave. From Germany and France, she left with barely her life. In the US, she also receives death threats, but like so much in the US, this is just a matter of individual, not group action. So all she has to do is answer hate mail. She doesn't have to flee a mob or escape totalitarian police. And so this time, in the wake of her Eichmann writings, she can experience the fragility she fears and survive it without having to leave. It's a repetition compulsion, and it can be seen as a source of vitality and danger, one to which she may have become habituated by earlier life experiences. And like the healthy forms of repetition, her repetitions don't always escalate. Actually, each one ends with her feeling more secure in her new home rather than less so. In America, too, she goes through these things with a man who remains by her side. He may cheat on her, but he doesn't betray her, as did Heidegger. She is, in short, a survivor, and if we see her that way, we can see that she plays a role in recreating the conditions of survival again and again. Throughout her life, she lurched from one crisis to the next. The film looks at one such moment, chosen because in it things happen in what is otherwise a thinker's life. This is what Pam Katz said last night. How do you make something happen in a thinker's life? This is a moment when it did. And I see that, but I think it's exemplary in just that way. This is how Hannah Arendt made things happen, psychoanalytic things happen for herself throughout her life. The film presents her as someone uncompromising, principled, a heroic thinker who's committed to thinking, and wherever it takes her, she'll go. And this is the case. But was she just a compulsive thinker, or did she follow a pattern of ruthless thinking to create a crisis that might render her homeless in her new home, which she was proud to say offered citizenship without demanding assimilation? The political equivalent, in other words, of the unconditional love that she never got from Germany or from occupied France. When she wrote the Eichmann book, she did it. When she pronounced ignorantly and offensively on racial protest politics in the 60s, only to be called out by Ralph Ellison, she did it again. In the 70s, she declared herself a woman, but no feminist. When she argued with Eric Voegelin about history and totalitarianism, when she criticized Zionism, one by one she picked fights with friends, co-residents, and family, each time resolving or seeking to resolve the dispute finally with some public or semi-public address. A public letter to Gershom Scholem, a semi-public talk or two in New York regarding the Eichmann controversy, another public letter later on to Ralph Ellison, this one, and maybe the only one, to involve an actual rethinking and an apology. So we have here, finally, with the Ellison letter, maybe repetition with a difference. She got out of her own way and was not self-thwarting, after all, in the end. I've never thought about Arendt this way, as someone repeatedly putting herself in a position of precariousness in order this time, each time, to overcome it less vulnerably. And I wouldn't have thought of her that way had Pam Katz not put her on the couch.
Oh, can
Wonderful.
that's brilliant, yes.
Well, had you heard that when you were writing, what would that have
Well,
made you do?
Well, first of all, the first thing I want to say was that's just a lovely paper. That's really, what's most, besides the fact that it's brilliant, what's really heartwarming is I feel as though we were obviously not thinking of this repetition compulsion. We were not thinking that she created a situation in which she would have to save herself again and again. And yet, as I said last night, the overarching idea was to portray her in a moment of exile. And what I feel now listening to you, and it's more or less, I wish Margarita was here, because it's more or less the greatest thing that can happen to a filmmaker is you make a dramatic fictional film, but one that's well researched enough to bring out certain truths about a historical figure. And you do it accurately enough and with enough imaginative depth that somebody like you can come along and actually take what we did and take it a step further, just because of what we represented. And that's a great feeling. About the couch, however, I have this sort of disappointing news. I think it doesn't make you wrong, it may make you even more right, but she did apparently, and it was described to us by many people, and especially, and I'm thinking now interestingly by Elizabeth Young Boole in her biography, she had a thinking posture. She did lie down and put her arm like this and close her eyes when she thought. So we weren't, and I'm going to go straight back to New York and ask Margarita if she was. I was not thinking of the analytic couch, but that doesn't mean we weren't thinking of it.
I didn't assume
right?
you were.
We literally just imitated, what people told us and what we read, but nevertheless, there it is. So, thank you.
Just make a remark. Is this on? As a kind of transition, there's a, it's not on. I like a better one. It's not on. Now it's on. Now it's on. A remark just as a way of transition to some of the other remarks. There's a line in the movie which, like some other moments in the movie, is accurate but transposed into a different person or a different context, and that is a confession that Hannah Arendt makes to Lotte, her secretary, and the quote is, "Some things are bigger than a single human being," which is in reference to the whole Heidegger experience, and it's actually, if I remember right, something that Arendt says to a niece.
Exactly,
In other words,
yeah.
it's a different, but no matter, it's perfectly valid in the movie. But it strikes me that insight, that kind of self-insight, is very significant in just the topic that Bonnie brings up, which is the relationship between Arendt and psychoanalysis, or a certain kind of political philosophy that is outwardly unsympathetic to psychoanalysis and a more psychoanalytic way of arguing. In other words, this idea that there are things bigger than a single human being, where she, in fact, is thinking about herself in ways that are both psychoanalytic, but also categorized in different ways.
What I'd like to do is bring it back to the film a little bit and talk about the opening scene and why it is and how it is that you decided to establish Hannah and Mary as women first before journalists and writers.
Okay, I will do that. I would love just to come to that from, once again, I feel like I had a kind of simple motivation for something that you analyzed correctly in a more complex way, and that's this moment where her husband comes home and has clearly been unfaithful, and she says, "I couldn't sleep all night." And in my case, what I was trying to do there is what one is always trying to do in the beginning of a film, which is to establish character without showing your hand, and or not showing it too terribly in any case. And I think there, what I was trying to say is something that I really believe about Hannah Arendt. She loved her husband. She cared about him. There were times when his betrayal did bother her. But the fact is, the things that I think bothered her deeply, in some ways on the deepest emotional level, were things like whether or not were intellectual ideas and thoughts. And I thought in that moment, yes, she's a woman, and yes, she cares. It's there. But what broke her heart, and as I spoke about last night with Heidegger, it was intellectual heartbreak and not romantic heartbreak. And there I was trying to portray a woman who's deeply devoted to the world of thought as and intellectual thought being the most important thing to her. And that was what I was trying to show there. It's a complex notion, but that's what was going on there. In terms of the conversation with Mary McCarthy, there are these double entendres, as we discussed last night. How can you forgive him? So that we think, as Michael was saying, we thought, okay, God, we're jumping right in here to the eggplant issue, but no, it's not that. We're talking about emotions and love. And sometimes when people said to us, how could you put an 8-minute speech at the end, Margareta would counter, there were a lot of people who wanted a film about a philosopher to begin with speech. And we decided that we wanted to begin with the woman and her personal life, even while simultaneously reinforcing that she cared deeply about her intellectual life. She was still a woman and still had this incredible relationship with Mary McCarthy, and was able to take her philosophical perspective and apply it to the 4 to 5 husbands and 92 love affairs of Mary McCarthy. That she could bring those two worlds together, where she says some men, like to dream, they have, some sense of power and importance. It's actually a quote from a letter to her where she really is talking about Mary McCarthy's husband. And I just found that combination of qualities fascinating.
Well, I think it's rare in Hollywood and in global cinema to have two females helming, directing, and co-writing. And I wonder if you can talk about that, if you didn't last night, about what that meant to have that perspective developing the script and the film.
I mean, for sure, Margareta has made, I've lost count, I think it's something like 35 films. She came up with the new German cinema filmmakers like Volker Schlendorf and Herzog and Wim Wenders. So she's used to being one of the, not only, but one of the very few women in the room. She was a very political, left-wing 68er. And if she was going to be the only woman who was there, she was going to do so. And she was every bit, they're equal in so many ways. So she, comes from a tradition of, I don't like to call her, I don't think she would like to be called necessarily a feminist filmmaker, although she certainly concerns herself with very powerful female figures. But after that, and this is really true, and I always try not to sound like a betrayer. I use what we call the F word, I use the feminist word, I have a feminist perspective, but in the case of this film, Originally, we had a male producer who just was not making it happening, so we came to the young Bettina Brokemper, who just jumped right in, had read Hannah in her teenage years, and was one of the only producers we met who'd read Hannah Arendt when it happened to be a woman, and she jumped in. I had worked with Margareta before, and a big part of her coming to me were also the Jewish New York American themes. We were a good pair that way, besides already liking to work together. The female camera woman was somebody Margareta had never worked with before, but she had a terrific reputation, did a great job, and here's the truth of European filmmaking. We got some money from France, and when you get money from a country or a region, you have to spend it there. And so one of the reasons they hired this particular camera person was more because she was French than because she was a woman. But when we all got up on stage, the premiere in Germany, Axel Milberg, who played Heinrich Blücher, said, "How do you think I felt being surrounded by all these women?" And we looked at each other, and I honestly mean this, and it's rarely the case, it was the first time we realized how many women there were. So it was, and there was about 8 producers on this film, and I think 4 or 5 of them were women as well, and so they were all standing there also. But it wasn't some idea that only women can make this film. In each case, can honestly say that everybody was picking the best possible person for the job. The female film editor we had, as well as the top film editor in Germany. So, there you go.
Well, it's time to counterbalance and have a male academic perspective, I think. So, do you have any prepared marks, Honig?
I do.
Please.
Thank you. And yes, male academic perspective. I will not speak about Arendt as a person, but about other aspects of the film and of her thought. The question that is most intriguing for me after seeing the film is how to explain the continuous anger at Arendt. It's not, everyone knows it. I mean, everyone who knows something about Arendt is familiar with the very hostile reactions that her work arise wherever it comes up, especially among Jews, and recently, not only recently, I mean, since the Eichmann book in Israel, in many occasions. And the question is, why it lasts so long? The emotional response of the survivors in the 60s is understandable. But we are not speaking about this kind of climate anymore. But even in the 60s, it is not obvious at all. Today, in Haaretz, in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, there's a very small story about an episode that took place in the early 50s in the leadership of a group of leaders of the Zionist labor, some kind of committee, that discussed the Kastner affair much before the Kastner trial. Kastner was the main figure, the main collaborator with Eichmann in Budapest. And he was, there was a Kastner trial in the 50s in which someone blamed him for what he did, and he tried to sue for libel, you see? Libels. So this debate that came to public awareness in the late 50s was already known to the leadership of the Zionist parties, the labor Zionists, just after the establishment of the State of Israel. I grew up in a revisionist right-wing family, and my father's best friend was the lawyer for the defense in the Kastner trial. So for me, the critique of the leadership of the Jewish Jewish leadership in Europe was obvious. There was nothing scandalous about it. I heard it all the time. And everyone on the right in Israel was very familiar with these accusations. And somehow, right after the trial, the Eichmann trial, these sentiments disappeared. And Arendt was received as if everyone forgot about what people knew about the collaborations of the Jewish leadership. So it is a very intriguing question, both about the moment of the writing of this book and its publication, and about its ongoing history and the history of Arendt's work as a whole. I don't have an answer to this, but there's one thread of thought that I would like to present as a beginning of an answer. There is several moments in the film in which Arendt is expressing a great surprise that Eichmann is just a bureaucrat. We heard this already. But I would like to emphasize the bureaucrat, not just an ordinary man, not just being mediocre, but a bureaucrat. She says it several times. But he's just a bureaucrat. But this is a very surprising surprise for someone who wrote the chapter on race and bureaucracy as the center of the second part of the origin of totalitarianism, the critique of imperialism. This is the second part. I just want to read the two sentences from the opening of this chapter, Race and Bureaucracy. Two new devices for political organization and rule over foreign peoples were discovered during the first decades of imperialism. One was race as a principle of the body politic, and the other bureaucracy as a principle of foreign domination. So the fact that Eichmann was a bureaucrat should not have surprised her. There was nothing surprising about this. Something else is there. It's the kind of bureaucrat that he was, I think, that is very intriguing for her and very important for her. And I think that what she does, what the film shows her doing, and to a great extent this is right, is to emphasize his thoughtlessness. It's not just a bureaucrat, it's a thoughtless bureaucrat. But again, this is surprising because bureaucracy in this chapter, from the origin of totalitarianism, is represented by the General Counsel, the British General Counsel for Egypt, Lord Cromer, who was a great man, according to her reading of his diaries and text. He was an engineer of a new form of government with no precedent. And she portrays him as a really a great architect of government and governmentality, we would say today. So there is a spectrum of bureaucracy. From Cromer to Eichmann. And I think that this spectrum is the key for her analysis of evil. The continuity between ends. This is a kind of continuum. It's always, her thought is always on a continuum, identifying elements and asking for the continuum, how they spread from thoughtlessness to the great architecture of bureaucracy in this particular case. And I think that this is crucial for understanding of her analysis of evil. Again, back to the film, I think there are a very, very interesting way in which the film shows the change in her understanding of evil. In the first seminar room, the first occasion where she teaches in a seminar room, she speaks about radical evil. I'm not sure that in the 60s she still has this in mind, but certainly this is what she writes here. Evil was radical in Nazi, into the totalitarian regimes. And then at the end, the last conversation with the students, or in the speech, I don't remember exactly, she speaks about the banality of evil and about the extremity of evil. And this is, I think, a very important change. Because in the first episode, you could understand her to say that there is something distinct about the totalitarian regime and its specific production of evil. That is, it is completely original, it is not like anything else, and therefore there is a gap between this and everything else. But this is a very misleading impression, because even when she speaks about radical evil, I would like to read again just a sentence. When she speaks about radical evil in the last chapters of the book, the danger of the corpse factories and halls of oblivion is that today, with populations and homelessness everywhere on the increase, masses of people are continuously rendered superfluous if we continue to think of our world in utilitarian terms. And here, superfluousness is the definition of radical evil, making people superfluous. And it is immediately as it is presented as a continuum. There is the most extreme form in the totalitarian regime, but there's also the forms that we know from our own existence with homeless people and et cetera, et cetera. And when she redefines her position on evil later in the film and in the Altman book, in terms of extremities, she already puts it explicitly in comparative terms. Because if you speak about extremities, about evil being an extreme, it always extreme in relation to what? There's always a relational element here. It is an extreme in relation to certain circumstances, to certain context. It is more extreme here than there, etc., etc. Her theory of evil, if you read it properly, I think, is a comparative political theory of evil. And as a comparative political theory of evil, the genocide of the Second World War could not become sanctified. It is simply impossible. If you take this position, this comparative position, there's no way to sanctify the Holocaust. And I think this is the core of the issue. That her thought, her mode of thinking is a resistance, avant la lettre maybe, to the sanctification of the Holocaust, to turning the Holocaust into a kind of, I would say, a dogma of religion, or a set of dogmas of religion with its own priests and etc. I don't want to go too much about this. But I think that the opposition, the resentment, the anger, that her thought provokes today is related, among other things at least, to this element. That she is the epicurus of the new religion.
No, the only thing, it's very interesting, both aspects are fascinating, but when you first said, why this anger about the Jewish leaders, also in America, she quotes Raoul Hilberg, the book was out, Jewish people knew about it. What a lot of my relatives or the generation above me said that a big part of the problem was putting it in crude terms, airing Jewish dirty laundry in the pages of the New Yorker. It's one thing for Jews to know what Jewish leaders did, but you don't speak about this before the, excuse me, goyim, in public. So that was one element of anger that was explained to me, and it was contextual, and it was sooner after the war, and the pains were still there. Jews were not accepted into the academy in the way that they are now. It's unthinkable what kinds of quotas were going on at that time. So it wasn't a time to talk about what Jewish people did wrong. And I understood that, but it felt like something that was tied to the time. So we actually, believe it or not, contemplated writing a film about this controversy where we just talked about her theory of Eichmann, it's a terrifyingly normal bureaucrat, and because we felt that that was the longer lasting theory that she'd brought into the world, and which had caused a lot of controversy. I remember sitting there saying, okay, Eichmann was not a monster, that's important, we have to talk about that, but what about this conflict with the Jewish leaders? Is that too much tied to the time, and it's not timeless in the same way? But it was, of course, impossible to tell this story and explain the controversy solely in terms of her vision of Eichmann and her thoughts about him. You had to include the Jewish leaders, even though we really didn't have time to explain that context. I mean, that was almost a whole other movie. We just put it on the table and say, this is what people were angry about, and let some questions come out about it, but we can't talk about the role of quotas and this and the silence of the Jewish American immigrants and so on. But it was impossible to tell the story, and what has surprised me in the response to the film, that when it has been critical of Hannah Arendt, in my experience, it centered more on what she said about the Jewish leaders than on what she said about Eichmann, even today. So it is, for me, an eternal question how that keeps coming up when it is known, documented, and not a surprise. It's the way she spoke about it, I understand that, but still.
I think that if we understand that there are various degrees of collaboration, they were necessarily there, and that she brings it out very explicitly, then you cannot create the otherness, the complete otherness of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Because Jews are
Yes.
implicated, as everyone else.
It's interesting that this precise issue with which you ended, Adi, involving the sacralization and desacralization of the Holocaust comes out very interestingly early in the film in the scene between Blücher and Hans Jonas, where Jonas takes the position that it is the sacred right, as Heilige Recht, of the Jewish people in the name, or represented by the Israeli state, to put Eichmann on trial, and Blücher can't believe that he's using that language of the sacred right.
Yes.
So that again brings the gender and the private-public issue back into focus, because it doesn't come out in a scene with Hannah Arendt, but with Blücher and Jonas. But that's where it's placed. I mean, that's where precisely this issue is placed in the film. I think it's very convincing. Should be open, please. Please.
I thought the film was wonderful to start with. But I grew up in what I suppose would have been considered a family, an intellectual family of German Jews who escaped in 1938. And they saw Hannah Arendt as a modern woman and held her up to me as a kind of model. And they subscribed to both the Aufbau, the reconstruction of the German Jewish paper, and to The Nation, which ironically I still subscribe to. But as you were talking, and I'm now talking about the 4 years that you were, when I was a young teenager and my German was extremely more fluent than it is now, I was asked by my parents to read Arendt's essays in both of them. And I'm not really surprised as a result. and I have read it, by her book on Eichmann. Because in the Aufbau, she, from very early, I mean, I'm talking about the late 40s, early 50s, she was very clear in her essays in saying, get over it. You know, I mean, she did that in a much more politico-philosophical way, but it was sort of, you're here, live here, and it still went back to Heidegger a lot, you know, think your thoughts, but don't let your thoughts portray your actions. What you're here for is very much to continue thinking, bringing your kind of intellectual vigor to the United States. And I truly had the feeling that, like my father, she really felt as though she'd come to Nirvana, that the United States, and you say that in your film, in The Nation, she was much more critical. It was much more, you know, the United States should stop doing the stupid, it was pre-McCarthy stuff. And she was much more cautious about how she approached the Jewish question. And I'm wondering, and you said you did a lot of reading of the earlier Hannah Arendt. I'm wondering if there was any connection. I mean, I came yesterday and listened to you, and I'm here today, and I'm talking too long. But my real question is, was there a connection? Did she finally feel fed up about these two parts, about being careful in things like, I haven't read the Partisan Review, but let's assume she was more, as she was in The Nation, a kind of political philosopher. And then this other part of her, you talk about her saying, in the movie, about her saying, you know, I'm not loyal to any group, I'm only loyal to my friends. And I have the feeling that the Aufbau, she was much more doing that. And I just wonder if this was the culmination, the personal, to go to the psychoanalytic, the personal culmination of who she was, to say it truthfully in a philosophical way, from her point of view.
I mean, I bet everybody here can answer that better than me, but the only thing I should add to that is that when she says, I love no nation and no group, I love only my friends, that is actually a quote from letters that she exchanged with Gershom Scholem. And it was actually he who wrote to her after the publication of the Eichmann book and said, do you have no love for Israel? Do you have no love for the Jewish people? And that was her response in writing to him. And I found for myself that was a very beautiful way for her to express her deepest feelings about how she moved in the world. Some people criticized us for putting the words of Gershom Scholem into Kurt Blumenfeld, and I thought that took an enormous backseat to finding what I think is the most moving scene in the film and giving her a chance to speak in a certain way directly from the heart. Even if Gershom Scholem wasn't that close a friend, she said something that I thought was a profound statement about herself. But I thought that loving America didn't preclude criticizing it. I mean, for Hannah Arendt, criticizing is love, I think. But again, I'm sure that people here could answer in more depth about that split in terms of her attitude towards America.
I'm just laughing because that's so Jewish. Love is Christianism. Well, I was just going to say that those articles that you read in Aufbau and elsewhere have all been collected into these volumes called The Jewish Writings, and so they're very accessible now if you want to revisit your earlier reading. And you guys probably read some of them, at least for the film. But it was a day and a time when you could write in different voices for different audiences and kind of selectively, which you couldn't do now because it would all be all over the internet that you said this there, not there. Yeah, so, so she definitely did have kind of different modes of presentation and different styles of argument that she used for different audiences. I think that's right. But she was also, even though she wrote those things in the Aufbau, they weren't private in the sense that, that was one of her first contretemps. It was one of the first sort of big debates that she got into with American Zionists about the things that she was writing about Israel. One of the things she was most concerned about with the sacralization of the Holocaust was the way that that would affect how Israel would be founded as a country. She was worried about that earlier than most people. And she understood that a country that was founded as a refuge for victims of the Holocaust and not as a place for free citizens would be inflected and infected by that particular formation all the way through its history. And she predicted the kind of refuge mentality that would eventually take it over if it was founded in that way, and founded in a way that made it dependent on the generosity of the great powers, as she called them at the time. So it's a very rich trove of work to go back to now because it was so prescient and therefore timely for us too.
Yes. Yes.
Hi, my name is Saudi. I'm one of the undergrad fellows at the center. So I considered Hannah Arendt. It's my first time thinking or talking about her, but I'm interested in migration and how things like the idea of the bureaucrat, the people who are in their daily lives actually like shaping nations and shaping social formations all around that we never see. So I was curious about that idea and how you maybe in your reflection of what's happening, for example, with illegal immigration in the US or all these other forms of control and I guess oppressive regimes, how you have seen Hannah Arendt or her work still be completely relevant or maybe not relevant or whatever you might, however you might see it in our society today, just for my own interest and just to bring this topic, I guess, into another realm.
So what about the contemporary relevance of Hannah and this film too, in social context?
I think that for the issue that you raised, there is a whole body of literature for which her framing of what it is to be a refugee and what it is to be stateless is just the beginning of the discussion. It is assumed as a point of departure, and I think in a very deep and fruitful way. Going farther than this, it's a whole seminar.
But well, just one example, though, from Origins of Totalitarianism. She has this great line where she's talking about the fate of the stateless, and which is to be without rights, because if you don't have citizenship, you don't have rights. And this is before the UN declarations, before the UN, obviously. But even so, I think she would say that without state institutions and citizenship, you exist as a rightless and superfluous person. And so at one point, she's talking about someone who... that your condition, in order to make this point poignant, she says that if you're in that situation, the best thing that you can do is to commit a crime. Because as soon as you're arrested, you acquire some rights by virtue of having been arrested. So suddenly you can have a lawyer, you have a voice, you have a name in a courtroom. None of these things are yours when you're just a stateless, undocumented person. And I was thinking about it just the other day because I was looking at that story of that young man. Gosh, I don't remember what state it's in. It's a horrific story of a young man, an African-American man who was arrested because he was in Pennsylvania, I think, because he was too covered up, but the police decided that a covered up racial minority should be arrested. But they didn't arrest, I'm sorry, it's the other thing, where they suspected, there's so many, where they suspected someone of having drugs inside his body, and they took him for a rectal exam and a colonoscopy and all these other things, and they never arrested him. And so it never kicked in that he could ask for a lawyer, so because they kept saying, well, you haven't been charged. And so they did all of these horrible things to him, and the hospital charged him afterwards for the bill, too, And they did them with probable cause that they thought that he had drugs on him, which he turned out not to. But I thought of that Arendt line, it's just to say how timely she is. I mean, it's like 50 years after she wrote it, and I thought, well, if they'd have arrested him, he would have had some rights. He wasn't actually undocumented, but even citizens, and this was her point, that the line, once you're in a government of superfluousness, the line between citizenship and non-citizenship, even that line eventually will erode. And that's exactly the function of the totalitarian form. So it's just, a thinker who wrote things 50 years ago that still come to your mind when you're reading the newspaper is someone who I would argue is quite timely in the ways that you're asking about.
But it's also a good place to introduce this comparative aspect, because in many places, including Israel, including part of Europe, if you commit a crime as an illegal immigrant, you're not granted any rights. You're just thrown into some concentration camp.
Yes.
So these are the elements from which the regime-made disasters are made.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to say that a name that's come up very often, and I'm still not sure how I feel about it, is Snowden. Because a lot of the analysis of Eichmann is about a man who, took the Führer's word as law, and he's asked by the judge in the course of the trial, as we show in the film, would it have been better had there been more civil courage? And there's a place where I feel Eichmann answers quite sincerely along the lines of whether or not he was putting on an act when he says, well, if the civil courage had been hierarchically organized, then things would have been different. And just the fact that he could think such a thing could be hierarchically organized. But in any case, the Third Reich was made up of many people who followed the law as it was laid out for them without questioning its moral code. I'm still to this day confused about Snowden, what I think of him, what I don't think of him, but his name comes up quite often, as does Chelsea Manning, and people who have decided the law that they're obeying is immoral and they're going to break it. And I think that Hannah Arendt, in a lot of her work, has a lot to say about that. And the other thing that we had wanted to do more with, but ended up kind of abbreviating into a question at the end, is the idea of international courts for crimes against humanity. I mean, that's something that didn't exist in the same form when she was reporting on that trial, and she spoke a good deal about that and corresponded a lot with Jaspers about crimes against humanity and how they should or should not be punished, or if they can be punished. And I think that she was very forward-looking with that, and it has a lot to say about what's going on today.
And just on the Snowden point, she was an admirer of Daniel Ellsberg and what he did with the Pentagon Papers. So there's, some clues about what she might have thought about Snowden.
I saw a play a while back about the kidnapping of Eichmann from Argentina by the Israeli Mossad, I guess. And the fact that Ben Gurion was insistent that he had to be tried in Israel. This was totally against international law, but he had to be tried there. And I think that goes to, I think there's a lot going on here that's not even, we're touching it superficially, but the politics behind that trial and the development of the state of Israel was very important to the, I think Ben Gurion saw it as a psyche, as a moment to create a uniformity in a country as kind of a mess of people. And that rallying cry of never again is never again. I was shocked to learn that, I think all Israeli soldiers go to Auschwitz, whether they're Moroccan, Tunisian, or whatever, wherever they come from, they go to Auschwitz or take this walk in Poland to be reminded of the Holocaust. It is so central to the psyche of Jews. So of course, the idea that Jews could have in any way, any small way been involved is not part of the mythology of the Holocaust or the mythology behind that never again. And I think that what you said is absolutely true. I am getting very sad by the almost commercialization of the Holocaust. The word itself has been cheapened. It's used for anything now. It doesn't have any significant meaning. And there are plenty of other, quote, Holocausts going on, but but that one seems to be so central to the psyche. So anyone that dares to defame it in any way gets attacked by the ADL. It's an anti-Semitic thing. And I think that the university and Jews within the university have to, and it's always going to be attacks by someone, but there has to be, it has to be analyzed. This needs to be put on a bench continually. And I think that I loved that film because it really touched that part of me that is kind of, when are we going to grow out of this victimization? The truth of the matter is, I think as, and I'm a member of the tribe, that I don't want to be a victim anymore. I think that Holocaust continues to victimize people. I am glad that the Germans accepted responsibility. That's where it should be. And it's not that the victim has to continually suffer. The perpetrators of these crimes have to come to, to face their day. And I'd love to see them face it more in Austria, but which shows the state.
Well, I do one more question.
Yes.
Yes. I had the good fortune of being a student at Bard for 4 years, 64 to 68. And then I got my PhD at the New School, so she was a constant in my higher education. I was a psychology major, but she had an immense influence on me being a student at the Oscars. I turned to existential psychology. She made me duly suspicious of psychoanalysis. So she was an immense influence, allowed me to come to her courses even though I wasn't a philosophy student. And so I just want to make a couple remarks about her as a person, if that's okay. I think students are naive, so I, of course, didn't see a lot of the depth. The movie was fabulous. Seeing, and I saw things about her that I didn't know. But there, I do think that the stress on being in exile or being vulnerable misses what I always saw as her central characteristic was an ebullient spirit and a really fun person and a really fun teacher, bright and synthetic, and would teach 2 hours. We had 2-hour lectures at the New School, evening classes only, so we could sleep in. And she would come for an 8 o'clock lecture. It was like going to Broadway. She would come, full of herself. I didn't sense any kind of feeling rejected from her, any kind of return to her critics. She rarely, if ever, brought up the Eichmann issue in her lectures. She didn't seem the least bit resentful of what I didn't know at the time, but what apparently was a rejection by Hans Jonas and others who I knew that there were people who disliked her defense of Heidegger, because many of the influences for me were critical theorists like Adorno who were quite suspicious of Heidegger, as was Arendt in a certain. She was suspicious of the kinds of things that he thought, but she never named him. But she also never drew from him. And it was interesting in her lecture. She talked about Jaspers, she talked about Nietzsche, she talked about Adorno, and she talked about Kant. But very rarely, if ever, about Heidegger. But I just wanted to emphasize that she was a very uplifting person. It was really captured in the defense speech. That defense speech was how she taught every class. It was incredible. It was the joy of my life and the luck of my life to be able to have that. And I just want to mention one other thing, that it was probably, if I would think of anyone as living that kind of life in exile and repeating that over and over, it would have been, I heard you say Blucher, I don't know, we called him Blucher when I had him as a teacher. So Blucher was like that. He was serious, he seemed to have weight on his shoulders, and he wasn't happy with us as students at the time because we were all smoking marijuana and taking LSD, and he thought that took away from political activism. Of course, he was an activist. We didn't agree. I think if you look at the people who were marching against the Vietnam War, many of them would be also smoking marijuana. But anyhow, he was a very serious character, whereas Arendt was much more happy, partying, not just with that inner group, but she had many, she had reached fame by the time I knew her in 1970, and I sensed that she kind of stood apart from the rest of the faculty at the rest of the graduate faculty of the New School, but only because she was more famous. I had no sense, she didn't give off any vibes of feeling victimized. And that's all I wanted to add. And thank you for the
Thank you.
Well, we can hardly do better than an eyewitness account to close, but congratulations on crafting marvelous work that can not only attract but can stimulate an audience like this.
Thank you. Thanks.